Right. Good afternoon. This is the Energy and Environment Committee, Environment and Energy Committee. And I am having Tuesday morning confusion. We are going to continue our discussions of S100 and Act relating to housing opportunities made for everyone. And our first witness will be Sue Minter. Welcome, Sue Minter. Sue, are you with us? You are muted.
Chatting with her now.
Oh, that is not good. Can't hear us. We can now see you. And let's see. I don't know if there's anything I could be doing here.
The channel 3 was muted this morning.
Hear me?
Yes,
I cannot hear you.
Oh,
You can hear me.
Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear us?
I could start my testimony, Madam Chair, but I don't hear you. Would you like me to try to exit and re-enter, or would you like me to just share my testimony? And if you can put a note in the chat.
yeah, we're good. So can you chat with her and see? Maybe she should try not using her headphones. Yes, if you could start. Where to start, I guess.
You can do it this way.
No, I can't hear. It's not the headphones.
Yeah, well, you have to unplug them. Oh. Yeah. Yeah, they are Bluetooth.
Me?
We can
You can hear me, and I still can't hear you.
hear you.
Do you want me to just go ahead, Madam Chair, at this point? Okay.
Yes.
Let's get us started. Thank you. Okay. Sorry for the technical inconvenience. I just want to thank you all very much for inviting me to join you for what I understand is an attempt to talk about housing and equity and some of the very serious challenges that our most vulnerable Vermonters are facing right now in 2023. For the record, I'm Sue Minter. I'm the Executive Director of Capstone Community Action, which is a community-based anti-poverty nonprofit, which was established in 1965. We serve the counties of Washington, Lamoille, and Orange counties, and are one of 5 community action agencies across the state that make up the Vermont Community Action Partnership, VCAP. So the great folks who work for us at Capstone are really what I would say on the front lines of the war on poverty, providing crisis support for those who face food insecurity, housing insecurity and homelessness, or just enough heat to stay warm through the winter. We also work to build ladders out of poverty by providing tools and opportunities to help our clients gain economic self-sufficiency and self-esteem. So really, I'm here to provide perspective from the lens that I have, watching Vermonters literally wait outside in the dead of winter without warm clothes, just for our food shelf to open. I'm speaking from a place of seeing the economic and racial divide in Vermont continue to grow and experiencing the trauma and despair among a growing number of Vermonters as we all try to exit this global pandemic. And I'm here to reflect on the bill before you and try to provide perspective on the incredible urgency that literally thousands of Vermonters who will soon be unhoused from area hotels or who face eviction from the inability to pay their rent. From where I sit, it is clear that on every level, we have a severe housing shortage in Vermont, and this shortage is negatively affecting every region of our state in its own unique ways. And I know you've learned the macro picture of the current undersupply of housing and the increasing demand for housing and the concurrent escalation of price in our existing housing stock. And the lack of stable housing and a growing housing supply means that Vermont's economy faces stagnation without adequate ability to attract a diverse workforce and threatening our businesses and our community vitality. It is so clear to me that Vermont needs to rapidly scale up housing and housing density of all types and at all income levels as quickly as possible. And I want to say that in this sort of moment of racial reckoning, Vermont also needs to face the structural inequalities and racism that is built into the many forms of restrictions and regulations that have become significant barriers to building housing throughout Vermont. And this is why I strongly support S100, which seeks to remove some of these barriers. It's also why I'm working with other committees of jurisdiction in the legislature to increase funding for the supply of affordable housing and shelters, along with supportive housing services. So I also want to say, as a matter of full disclosure and potential relevance, that I have a history in my career of working in the planning field. My degree is in planner, and I worked for 10 years at the Vermont Department of Housing in community planning, downtown revitalization, also as a local planning commissioner in my town of Waterbury, a staunch defender of Act 250, and a promoter of smart growth, including when I served as Secretary of Transportation. I established new programs to expand public transportation and to marry planning with transportation funds to create great places, walkable downtowns, and community centers. And now in my new role, combating the causes and conditions of poverty, I've also begun to better understand how some of the unintended consequences of some of these very policies in our current economic context. So each year, some 11,000 Vermonters will walk through one of Capstone's many doors, seeking healthy food, warmth during our hard winters, early education programs for vulnerable at-risk children and their families, and for help navigating what is only described as a Byzantine system for navigating people needing to find a roof over their head. During the last federal fiscal year, Capstone's frontline housing support team worked with 523 families. So we see Vermonters who come to our doors in desperation. They come from all walks of life. They're senior citizens, families with kids, single working adults, people with disabilities, and they're really bound together by a common thread of severe insecurity of losing the stability of a home because they can no longer afford their rent, or the extreme challenge of being unhoused altogether. Right now, in Washington County, there are 375 adults and children sheltered in area motels. In Lamoille County, 146 adults and 46 children were in the motels. Across our Head Start program, 30% of the children we serve are homeless. And across the whole state, there are over 2,000 adults and 600 children who are currently living in area hotels. And after this July 1st, their collective fates are unknown. Capstone staff provide supportive services, case management, other key tools to help lift people into stable housing. And over just the last 5 months of our service, our housing team has worked with 212 households in search of housing, but only 35 of them have been able to find safe and affordable long-term housing. And this is because there is simply no available housing for the folks at this level of housing need, particularly those who are unsheltered and unhoused. And this is in despite of new vouchers, the Section 8 program. It's been considered a lifeline. This is the very resource that used to be considered a golden ticket, but there's literally no place to throw the life preserver. After years of our staff working tirelessly to get their clients into the Vermont Rental Assistance Program, VRAP, they are now faced with letting the clients know that not only has the program ended, but there's nowhere for them to go. One of the capstone counselors, housing counselors, sadly calls Section 8, quote, the program of empty promises. So we couple this gaping disparity of available apartments, vouchers, and skyrocketing rents, and we understand why Vermont is ranked second in the country right now, middle into California, I believe, for the rate of homelessness. And as difficult as it is right now, I am deeply worried about what lies ahead, because during this very month of April, a cascade of pandemic era supports are dissolving or gone. April marks the end of the SNAP 3 Squares emergency allotment, which will affect over 70,000 Vermonters. April is also the end of our Vermont Everyone Eats food program. In central Vermont alone, where we've been the hub distributing over 5,000 nutritious meals every week. This is also the month when the Medicaid unwind is beginning, again affecting low-income Vermonters accessing their health care. And the Vermont Child Tax Credit is also on the chopping block in this body. And then there is VRAP, which not only has helped provide safety to house some 2,500 Vermonters in area hotels, it has also provided critical rental assistance for some 10,000 Vermonters. And we're really just beginning to see what the effect of removing this rental assistance will mean, as many clients are coming to our aid, facing evictions in homes they can no longer afford. So we really have yet to experience the full impact of these programs ending. But I really am here to say we can't think that we can just go back to the way it was pre-pandemic. We are now facing a new era of housing unavailability and costs, coupled with high food costs, fuel and heat for transportation, that we've really never experienced before. And we are working with our area partners to try to prepare for the unhousing of hundreds of people just in central Vermont. Right now, the state is estimating that in Washington County alone, about 100 people will be unhoused from the hotels at the end of May and 200 at the end of June. And the General Assistance GA program is really on the precipice statewide of exiting more people from the motels this summer than we've ever seen. So we're trying to plan for this. We work with area partners, communities, public safety officers. The guests we support in our GA subsidized motels are elderly, some are infirm, living with disability or mental illness or substance misuse. Many are fleeing domestic violence, or they're simply Vermonters who work every day and return home to a motel. While far from a perfect model, these motels have been a lifeline, and we can't find our community, the lifeline that we can't find in our communities without a diverse housing stocks. Guests have found recovery jobs, they've gotten healthy, had their surgeries, and they've also found compassion and serve with our service providers. If these motels close as proposed, we will truly be facing a pandemic and of poverty and homelessness across our state. And I need not remind you all of the very real dangers involved in this moment of supporting people who are unhoused. We all grieve the tragic murder of a young Vermonter, Leah Rosen Pritchard, whose passion was to spread radical love by providing shelter for those in need at Morningside House in Brattleboro. So, as difficult as the current situation is, I do see signs of hope. I see hope in every victory that our staff achieve, finding people a home, a healthy meal, and a job. And across the state, our Community Action Network has served over 1,400 individuals experiencing homelessness to find permanent housing during the pandemic. 121 Vermonters experiencing homelessness were provided emergency housing, and 714 individuals experiencing homelessness were helped to find permanent housing. I see hope in the historic investments into the affordable housing and shelter programs that you all have made through this pandemic. When built, these will really help, although not solve our current challenges. I also see hope in the hard work that has delivered us this needed legislation, S-100. This bill tries to remove barriers and help incentivize communities to build more housing at greater density. Removing these barriers will be a critical investment in the long term for Vermonters. But from where I sit, it cannot come quickly enough. I want to emphasize in particular our strong support of the sections, section 44-12-1H, which prohibits bylaws from penalizing a hotel from renting rooms to provide housing assistance through the GA programs, as well as section 44-13-A1G, which restricts the ability of communities to prohibit emergency shelters. Both of these sections will assist the serious need for GA assistance and new shelters. At this moment of national racial reckoning, and as Vermont seeks to address the forces that continue to make our state unwelcoming to BIPOC Vermonters, I strongly believe we all need to think carefully and constructively about the rules we set around where and what people can build or not build. We need to recognize that many of the rules that we have put in place over decades are now limiting access to young people, to low-income people in the BIPOC community. These rules are effectively denying the economic diversity that our state and community needs. And they are upholding a structural racism that makes our state unwelcoming. Addressing poverty has never been easy, and our homelessness challenges are not going away, and we must forge onward. I believe S-100 is a chance to begin to unravel those barriers and to enable communities to finally remove structures that stand in the way of a more diverse and welcoming Vermont. And I'm just going to conclude my comments with a quote about hope from Barack Obama. Because without hope, we have despair in this difficult moment. Hope is not blind optimism. It's not ignoring the enormity of the task ahead or the roadblocks that stand in our path. It's not sitting on the sidelines or shirking from a fight. Hope is that thing that sits inside us, despite all evidence to the contrary, that something better awaits us if we have the courage to reach for it and work for it and to fight for it. Hope is the belief that destiny will not be written for us, but by us, by the men and women who are not too content to settle for the world as it is, who have the courage to remake the world as it should be. And I thank you for your time and all of your dedication and service, and for your courage in this important moment. Thanks for listening. And I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I don't know what to do, Madam Chair.
Yeah, so we can't ask questions, I guess, but
That's no testimony.
she has it. She's got her
If you leave a message in the chat,
testimonies.
May
Representative
we
Smith.
comment?
I don't know what else to do. I can try to go out and come back in and see if I can hear at a separate time. Would that be a good idea, Madam Chair?
Okay.
You can give me a thumbs up, things down.
So, I don't know. We got to keep going. I think we'll say
Thumbs down. You're just going to say goodbye? Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you all so much. I know you've been working hard on a lot of things, and this is a big one. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I'd like to ask the committee a question.
Okay, what's your question?
Well, and I wrote this down, so I'm going to read it if that's okay, so I'll get it right.
Okay.
I believe this bill does not belong in environment and energy. I mean, this testimony, I should say. This is a housing bill, and we are not the housing committee. We should be addressing Act 250. I need to put these on so I can see what I'm talking about. we should be addressing Act 250. I believe general housing has been passing the buck to us here at this committee. Bill needs to be divided somewhere around page 35. Our part is first. Housing is the second part. Racial and BIPOC should not be entering into environment and energy when we have issues with Act 250 to address. That's my opinion. And I think that somewhere toward the end of this bill, that, like I said, I think housing kind of passed the buck to us on it, the entire bill.
Okay, we'll have time for discussion. It seems like a good topic for discussion.
All right, yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Brian Shoup is our next witness. Welcome, Mr. Shoup.
Thank you. I'm Brian Shoup. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Natural Resources Council. VNRC has been working on issues related to land use planning and development regulation and natural resource protection for 60 years. Almost always as a defender of strong and appropriate regulations to help communities guide growth in the state. My own background before coming to VNRC in 2008, I spent about 25 years as a community planner working throughout the state, working on a lot of the regulations that not only are working to shape the growth and development in the state, but also are in many instances providing barriers to and including exclusionary practices for smart, compact residential development. And I think we're here generally in support of S100 as it was passed out of the Senate with a couple of provisions we'd like to comment on. Last summer and fall, Katie Gallagher, our Sustainable Communities Program Director, and I participated in, I don't know, maybe a dozen meetings with stakeholders who were convened by Representative Bongartz to try to find common ground on how we could improve our zoning practices in the state by changing Chapter 117 to try to eliminate some of those exclusionary practices that have created barriers to the type of housing that I think Vermont needs. And I really want to commend the Representative Bongartz and state my appreciation for really having found a lot of common ground, a lot among diverse interests. And I think that was an important thing. And I think that many of the provisions of this bill reflect that effort and should move forward. Before I talk about specific provisions of the bill, though, I would like to kind of address the overriding issue of whether to focus on zoning or Act 250. Our advice and what we would urge the committee to do is really to focus on the zoning provisions for several reasons. This is part of a national trend where it's fairly well documented. I know you're going to hear from other witnesses who have done some of that documentation that zoning practices have created barriers across the country. We have a national housing crisis, not a Vermont housing crisis, or not only a Vermont housing crisis. The factors affecting that crisis may differ a little bit from state to state, but a lot of states are dealing with the same issues. So you're not alone in looking at how towns regulate land use through their zoning regulations and other land use regulations to try to accommodate a greater mix of housing types and affordability. So Act 250 and zoning serve different purposes. Act 250 addresses the environmental, community impacts of larger developments, including those with regional impacts. It doesn't prescribe the use, the location, the density, the dimensional characteristics of any use except as they relate to site-specific details, whether it's impacting a wetland or a form of wildlife habitat. It doesn't define where development should be, with the exception of whether it complies with the municipal plan and whether it's in certain designated locations. I'm going to talk more about that later because that's an important consideration, I think, as you consider the bill moving forward. Whether a community supports compact neighborhood development and a mix of housing types really depends on the local zoning. You can have a 10-acre lot that has very similar characteristics. It's flat, it's wooded. One community might allow 50 units on it. Another community might allow 10 units on it. Another community might allow 1 unit on it. And that's based on a lot of variables, a lot of them legitimate, where the property is located, what the purpose of that zoning district is, what the overall plan for the community is, and how that 10-acre lot fits into that overall vision. But we came to the conclusion, I think, working with the stakeholder group last year, is that in those areas where we have water and sewer infrastructure, we should accommodate as dense and as compact a pattern of development as is appropriate, with certain caveats. And we should also make sure that we're promoting a mix of housing types, not just single family homes. And single family zoning has been one of the probably more significant nationwide barriers to diverse housing and greater affordability in the country. And this bill addresses that issue. And I think it does so in a way that maintains the ability of communities in the state to also protect our natural resources, especially those in outlying areas outside of those areas served by water and sewer. So it's another one of our concerns as we talk about the zoning and Act 250 dichotomy is the legislature has been dealing with Act 250 and trying to make adjustments to it to promote affordable housing for at least 20 years. The legislature has not dealt with zoning and the barriers that zoning might present to affordable housing for over 20 years. The last meaningful effort that I'm aware of was in 2021 when the legislature established a committee to look into barriers to affordable housing that are embedded in Chapter 117. I had the distinction of being a consultant to that committee, and a lot of the pieces that are in this bill were considered by the committee at that time, requiring duplexes to be treated like single-family homes, requiring certain densities where communities had the infrastructure to support it. They were considered a little too controversial at the time. They weren't pushed forward by the legislature. Looking back, that was probably a mistake. I think we could have made a lot of progress on housing affordability had we taken action at that time, and we didn't. However, since that time, there's been a lot of land use changes related to Act 250. The legislature has significantly increased the jurisdictional trigger for mixed income housing in downtown development districts. We've created other designation programs, the New Town Center program, which has been amended over time to create housing in those communities that don't have a historic downtown but want to create one. Probably most significant, we've created a growth centers program to help communities plan for regional centers of compact development that also have exemptions and meaning for Act 250. And probably most significantly during the Shumlin administration, the legislature created the neighborhood development program. And that program is intended to look at our village centers, our downtowns, our other designated areas in the area around them that are within walking distance to our downtown, to our village centers, and create a pathway where priority housing projects, which is a defined term, certain mix of housing types can be exempted from Act 250, provided the community has gone through kind of that pre-screening project to get designated as a new town center. I know Chris Cochran and Jake Hemmery have folks from Department of Housing and Community Affairs have testified on the programs. They are much better than I am at talking about the nuts and bolts of them. But they're all important programs, and they're all programs that were intended for different purposes, not necessarily to be a substitute for Act 250. And I'll expand on that in a second. With regard to the neighborhood development area program, my understanding is that nearly 3,000 priority housing project units have been created in those areas since the program was initiated about 6 or 7 years ago. And just last year, the legislature made significant changes to that law. We were involved in that to make it easier for some of the smaller communities to use the program. It also last year increased the cap of how many housing units could be considered a priority housing project in those areas that could be exempted from Act 250. That just went into effect, I believe, July 1 of last year. So it really hasn't been given a lot of time, but there has been a steady work done on trying to align Act 250 with the state's land use goals. This committee, or I guess your predecessor, the Committee on Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife, has passed two comprehensive Act 250 reform bills out of the House. At least one of them was passed out of the Senate, which really took a comprehensive approach to saying, how does Act 250 work? How does it look at different locations differently? Our position is that Act 250 probably doesn't add the value that it used to in certain areas that have been through the designation process. It's also failing to protect natural resources in other areas where we're seeing fragmentation of our forest land, development in river corridors, and other issues. So we have been encouraging that comprehensive approach. The inability to get it Act 250 passed into law, it's one thing to pass it out of this building, it's another thing to get it signed into law, prompted the legislature last year to direct two different studies. They allocated funding for the Department of Housing and Community Development to study the designation programs and take a hard look at all of their different purposes, whether they're all needed, whether they can be streamlined, whether they can be improved, and how they should interact with land use regulations like Act 250, to really try to better align them to serve the purpose of saying, okay, these are the areas we want development. These are the areas that we've identified the barriers and the environmental impacts that might be avoided through designation, and make those designation programs work. The state's just hired a group, Smart Growth America, a national organization, has been a leader in promoting smart growth policies across the country, working with some local planning consultants to do that work. And we're really excited about it. This legislature also directed the Natural Resources Board to look at two different things, to look at locational jurisdiction, which is what we've been moving to with all of those designations in the neighborhood development area, in the downtown development district jurisdictional triggers, to say, how do we make locational jurisdiction a consideration in Act 250? As it was passed, there was only one location that triggered Act 250 automatically, land above 2,500 feet elevation. And that was recognized that those areas are very sensitive. We need to make sure that even a single home in a large driveway can have a significant impact in those areas. Are there other areas in the state that should be treated similarly? So the NRB is looking at that. They have money in the budget and are seeking out a facilitator to help them with that work now. The other issue that they're looking at is the administration of Act 250. And this committee, or this committee's predecessor, did a lot of work on the administration of Act 250 last year. There's one thing I'll say about changes to Act 250 that have been made over the years. In 2002, 2004, when Act 250 was last overhauled in a comprehensive way, the legislature eliminated the environmental board, and the appeals process went to the courts. Research that we've done recently show that the appeals process takes about twice as long now in the environmental court as it did under the environmental board. Every developer I've ever talked to says time is money, and the appeals process, although rare in Act 250, only 1 or 2% of projects, and that's all projects, not just housing, are appealed in any given year. And there's a lot of good data available from the Natural Resources Board. And that 1 or 2% is, don't hold me to it in any one year, but that's pretty much my understanding of the average. That process, the administration of Act 250 is in need of repair, and that should be an important consideration. We're glad that the NRB is looking into that as well. So that's my background on before getting to the bill. I would like to talk about some specific sections of the bill, if that's okay, unless there's any questions before I go ahead.
Yeah, do members have questions on the background? Representative Torrey.
Just a quick question on these studies, when they're going to be done.
My understanding is by next legislative session. I believe, I don't know which one was supposed to be done in July, and it likely won't be, and they're going to be seeking an extension. But our goal and our hope, and I think the goal of the legislature in passing those studies, was that they be available for you for consideration next year. And I know we joke sometimes in our office that, yeah, a study is great, it's better than taking action, but I think these are the most meaningful studies when it comes to an important law that's guided development in the state over the years, and we really should get the information in the public process that's going to be coming out of them. So, yeah, I do want to be sensitive to that.
Representative Sibilia.
Yes, thanks for your testimony. You think that we have a housing problem in the state, that we need to build housing in the state?
Do I think so? Yes.
And Do you have an opinion as to where we should build that housing?
Yes, I believe that we should respect what has been a land use kind of overarching policy of the state for years of compact settlements surrounded by open countryside, working lands and natural areas. Compact development. So before coming to Vermont, just so you know, I spent a short time as the policy director for an organization called the Vermont Forum on Sprawl, who became Smart Growth Vermont. And we were a proponent for smart growth. That organization went away and we incorporated their tools and policies and programs into VNRC's Sustainable Communities Program, I believe in 2011, 2012. So going section by section, we support, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. Regional planning, different towns that have town plans that already have something along these Act 250 rules in place. Do you feel that there might be enough? Or do you think there needs to be more legislation overruling local planning?
I don't know that it overrules local planning. I do believe that there are instances where Act 250 may not be required, and when communities who are regulating development. And
will that still come into play, do you think?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm also, I would have to say, I'm a proponent of regional planning and a region setting a regional vision and having some accountability for communities in their zoning processes or their planning processes.
Thank you.
So we support section 1, which puts a cap on the amount of parking that communities can require. It's important to point out that we would propose that 1 parking unit per dwelling unit would be adequate, and developers will likely continue to provide more parking as an amenity, perceived amenity for their tenants or customers. But what we can do to decrease our reliance on this single occupancy automobile and build compact developments that serve by other transportation options is important. So I'm not going to get into a lot of detail for time's sake, but just tell you what we support and where we might have concerns. So we support that section. We do support section 2, which is probably the most consequential piece of legislation or piece of this legislation, to require that duplexes be treated equally as single family homes, kind of doubling up our density even in rural areas. Single driveways serving 2 families in a single building as opposed to serving 1. That was a consideration 20 years ago. And as I said, it was probably a mistake not to have done it then. We also support where you have water and sewer service areas, allowing a 4-plex as a use by right in all of those areas. We also support the provision that requires a minimum density in areas that are served by water and sewer, with one concern. We are concerned about the provision on page 5, lines 9 and 11, which we believe might be too narrow in limiting the types of environmental features that can be protected under zoning. This is particularly a concern in a handful of communities that have, in my opinion, have made a mistake in the past by overextending sewer and water service areas to areas that really aren't appropriate for compact development. And that in those areas, we're not saying they should be allowed just to have large lot zoning served by water and sewer, but we should expect communities to carve out natural features that should not be developed and that don't allow development. And we just would hope that would be clear in the bill. We do, and I'm sorry, I should have said at the beginning, I do have written testimony. It's still got some holes in it, and I'd like to submit it after the fact. I can fill in a couple of blanks, but we do have some specific language changes. And one of them would be where it says, an area served by municipal water and sewer service area means several things, including it excludes flood hazard or inundation areas as established by statute, river corridors or fluvial erosion areas as established by statute, shorelands, and we would add, or within zoning district or overlay district whose purpose is environmental protection and wherever new year-round residential development is not allowed. And I hope you would consider that language to make sure that there's some communities that I'm aware of, and I'm sure that you're going to hear from, have water and sewer areas that have overlay districts that have prevented development, or that they want to prevent development from being in, but they're in this larger area. So that's one particular specific change that we'll provide writing for or suggested language for.
Can I ask a question on that?
Sure.
Why focus on only overlays? And what underlying zoning was addressing it?
I'm not focusing on overlays. I wouldn't reference overlay. That was an example. I think that the zoning could have features that are off limits for development. That should be appropriate. Just an aside to that too, we're talking about water and service and served by water and sewer infrastructure. We often talk about water and sewer service areas. I did look at the statute that authorizes municipalities to manage their sewer systems. And it's pretty vague. It implies that they can manage it for land use goals or development goals. And I know some communities do. They will have a carve out for affordable housing, for example. They'll draw district boundaries that are intended to implement their land use goals or their environmental protection goals. But that's not authorized under statute explicitly. And there's no definition of a water and sewer service area or a sewer service area. And I'd like to suggest some language, I haven't drafted it yet, that would change that statute to make it clear that a municipality can manage its infrastructure in a way that furthers the goals of its town plan, promotes housing or promotes economic development, whatever their goals are, and protects the environment by avoiding extension into certain areas. And municipalities do have sewer service ordinances that do that. It just doesn't seem to be clearly authorized. It's not prohibited either. So it's just maybe a little bit of a uncertainty that communities are experiencing as this legislation goes forward.
Representative Sibilia.
I just want to make sure I understand what you are talking about. So no definition of water or sewer areas.
Yeah, this talks about areas served by water and sewer, and municipalities adopt sewer service area ordinances or maps or boundaries or policies. And the two are one and the same as I see it. They're defining where they're serving by water and sewer and where they're not and what their goals are. And I think that it's availability of infrastructure is really what this is all about. We want to use it as efficiently and effectively as possible. And I think just giving that clear authority to a municipality that they're managing their water and sewer service area, not just for the efficiency of the system and for maintaining public health and clean water, but by furthering their community land use and economic development and housing goals.
So giving them more say.
Yeah, I don't know that it would give them more say than they're already exercising, but it would make very clear that they have the authority to exercise that say. It's a very vague statute now as it relates to this.
Thinking about this kind of the totality of what we're doing here, because we've taken away, say, from the towns and a lot of things. So just thanks.
Just really quickly, section 3, Sue Minter said it well. We do support protecting emergency shelters. The definitions are fine under section 4. Under section 6, we do have a significant concern about change to the appeals process. And when we testified before the Senate Natural Resources Committee, they were dealing with a proposed language that would have eliminated the right of 10 residents or landowners in a municipality to appeal a zoning board decision, a local zoning decision. We supported that, but what we testified at that time was if you're looking for an alternative, we would hope that you would look for an alternative. And what we suggested that it be a person with a particularized interest, which is the standard for appeal of an A&R permit or an Act 250 permit. The language that came out of the Senate is we have some concerns about particularized interest is not a defined term in statute. Actually, a person aggrieved is. We would also encourage the committee to, like Act 250, allow an appeal of a person, not 10 persons with a particularized interest, and that we would suggest the bill as written says that the people with particularized interest can't appeal a decision based on character of the area. We would recommend that it be, can't appeal a housing or affordable housing project based on character of the area and not apply that same limitation to quarries and more potentially noxious uses in a town. So we have specific language we will send to the committee this afternoon that makes our suggestions. So I do. This is something that just came to my attention late last night. The subdivision provisions under Section 8. The allowing a zoning administrator to approve a subdivision, we believe it happens in minor instances now, especially with boundary line adjustments. As some folks brought to my attention, and I'm not giving you a recommendation at this time, I'm just raising an issue that I hope you'll hear more about, that the carte blanche allowing the subdivision review process to be administered by a zoning administrator really could carve neighbors out of some large-scale development project reviews. So I just want to flag that as something that I want to look into further, understand how extensive that authority is, because the subdivision review process, I spent maybe 18 years on our development review board. Land subdivisions is what we did. And it was of great interest to the community. I don't think we ever denied any, but we often addressed neighborhood concerns through the review process. And I want to just flag that as something that is only a recent concern that I didn't spend a lot, or our staff didn't spend a lot of time thinking about. But I do want to, I think you're going to be hearing about that. The Section 9, the appeals clarification, I just want to be clear that this provision that doesn't allow the appeal of a local development review board decision based on their finding that something meets the character of the area has been in statute for a while. That was one of the things that was actually done 20 years ago, I believe. And that is fine. And this doesn't change that, but it clarifies it. So it's just want to be clear that we understand that and we are fine with it. I want to raise a question about the energy codes. I understand the desire to have consistency across municipal boundaries when it comes to energy codes. As I understand this provision as it's written now, it grandfathers the 10 communities who have more extensive energy codes than the state stretch code, and it allows communities to additional communities to adopt new energy codes provided they go through a charter change. And my question, and this is honestly a question that I probably want to hear from the Public Service Department from, does the energy codes include heating sources? Because I know some communities have adopted ordinances to require fossil fuel free heating sources. My understanding of the energy code is it involves insulation and energy efficiency. And I raise that as we would encourage flexibility for municipalities to allow for development review boards and boards of adjustment under their regulations to look at heating sources to wean the state off of fossil fuels for heating our homes and businesses. And so I'm not sure whether this covers that or not. And one other thought that, sorry, but that's just a concern. So Section 16 does deal with Act 250. The 1055 rule has been around for a long time. I don't know its inception, but it's basically back when 10 units triggered Act 250 in all towns. That was changed when the legislature eliminated the 10-acre loophole for septic disposal. Prior to, I think it was 2003, 2004, you didn't need any septic approval from the state if you had a 10-acre or larger lot. That was eliminated, and a 1-acre town at that town became a 6-lot town. 6 units triggered Act 250 in those communities. And then in the 10-acre town, 10 lots still did. There was a concern in the day that developers were getting around that 10-acre threshold by piecemealing projects, doing it incremental, and that at some point, even if 10 houses or more were located on multiple lots, not adjacent to one another, they still could have an impact on community services or a cumulative impact on natural resources. This law changes that to 25 units within 5 years in certain designated areas. And we are fine with that. It does sunset that provision in 3 years. And we believe the intent of that was to allow the legislature to get those studies and to make more comprehensive overhaul of Act 250 and looking at those locational jurisdiction data that comes from the NRB. Likewise, it lifts the cap on priority housing projects in designated centers also with a 3-year sunset. So initially, when neighborhood development areas were created, the cap was different based on the population of the community. I believe, and I'm going by memory, I believe it was 75 for the largest municipalities over 10,000, 50 and 25 being below 2,500 population. Last year, the legislature eliminated the cap on the top communities and went from 50 to 75 in the next tier and 25 to 50 in the smaller communities. And this just eliminates it in those designated areas for that time frame. Does raise some concerns for us. Some large scale projects in small towns that might not have the same level of review and likely wouldn't have the same level of review that Act 250 would provide. But we also understand the urgency of the problem and the fact that we're hopefully on the verge of making more significant permanent changes to the law. So I'd like to say we don't oppose that change, maybe more than we wholeheartedly support it. The master section 16A, the master permitting process. I know it's been talked about for years. Master permitting is authorized. It has been used in certain instances, especially around industrial parks and ski areas. Downtowns kind of provide a complication to those other examples in that you have a lot of multiple ownership and different landowner objectives, but it's worth seeing if it works as far as we're concerned. Section 17B is interesting. One of the changes, what this requires is that, and I'm not reading from the legislation, but that in order to be designated as an NRB or to have the priority housing project area exemptions in one of the other designated areas, a municipality either has to have a wastewater system, a water system, or an alternative system approved by A&R. Last year, when the legislature made changes to the neighborhood development area, it actually eliminated that requirement. And the thinking was some of our village centers might have excellent water sources that aren't a municipal water supply or really good soils. And all of those facilities, wastewater and water supply, are going to be permitted by A&R. They're going to meet our basic water quality and source protection standards. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a municipal system. And I'm going to look to Representative Bongartz because I think he drafted that provision last year. This actually removes that flexibility and will make it more difficult for these areas to be designated. I don't believe that was the intent of the Senate. I think those changes happened in some of the last days to try to make what came out of the Senate Economic Development Committee consistent with the existing law for neighborhood development areas. And in turn, instead of changing what came out of the Economic Development Committee to comply with the new NRD law, it did the opposite. It changed the neighborhood development area NDA, sorry, not NRD, law by going back to where it was before last year. So our suggestion was eliminate that provision and just allow A&R permitting to do what it does. That makes sense? Okay. I'm wrapping up. The enhanced designation for village centers, we feel is unnecessary. The neighborhood development area provision applies to all designated areas. It applies not only internally to the land within an existing designated area, but also for example, the Village Center, but also to land nearby and adjacent to it. But it also has a designation process that is really designed to say, are we avoiding some of those features that would otherwise be regulated under Act 250? And does the community have the capacity and the rules in place to promote the type of smart growth, compact, walkable residential development that we're looking for? And we would like to strengthen that program, not provide an easy alternative to it. And we think this provides an easy alternative to it without really adding any value. So that is an area that we'd like to see removed in place of the existing neighborhood development area program. Finally, in the bill, the class 4 road provision, that's to me is just kind of a consumer protection provision. People should know what land they're buying and what to expect from the town that they're living, moving into with regard to whether that road is going to be maintained on a year-round basis and what the expectation is for them to maintain it. It's really as simple as that. So that's our comment and suggestions. And I apologize for not handing out draft language, but I will provide some suggestions very shortly. I do want to comment on on a proposal that the Senate rejected, and I understand may be afloat in the House, and that's to take that 25-5-5 rule, that rule that says we're going to allow you to build up to 25 units in these designated areas within 5 years, within 5 miles, and extend that to a townwide exemption for those areas, which would effectively say you could have 25 units of housing anywhere in a community, regardless of whether it's on a ridgeline, on a river corridor, or prime ag soils. And that to me is not enough. There's no affordability provision to it. It's just basically business as usual of building large second homes or primary homes scattered in our natural resources rather than concentrating it in the smart growth locations that we're looking for. So we don't feel like Act 250, unfortunately, has been an impediment to scattered residential development out in our natural resources. And this would even make it less of an impediment than it has been. And we've seen, we have presented to this committee a lot of data on forest fragmentation and the impacts that scattered kind of unplanned residential development is having in the countryside. So that's just a preemptive comment on an amendment that might come before the committee, and we'd be really eager to come back and talk specifically to it if that does happen. And in doing that, I would go into detail about how zoning varies from Act 250 and why how it continues to play a very important role in nearly every community, not necessarily everyone that has zoning. In one provision of the bill, I think getting to Representative Sevilla, another comment, is there is a provision of the bill that looks at delegation to municipalities. And we are open to that discussion. This bill does it in a limited way. It does it for development within certain designated areas, which I don't think satisfied some of the proponents of it. I think that should be part of that larger conversation when we talk about the administration of Act 250, locational jurisdiction, and our designation programs in more detail. So, but we're don't oppose it moving forward with the bill as is. We question whether it's going to really provide much benefit to any municipality, but we also don't think it will have any downside to any resource or any municipality. I think that's all I have.
Thank you for your testimony. Members have questions. Presenting Bongartz.
While you're here, there was a proposed provision that came up for discussion on another committee about this, to the effect that a developer could build 4 houses anywhere, many times as the developer wanted to, and not be subject to Act 250 jurisdiction.
Yeah, our problem with that is same as the 25 anywhere. It's basically, at what point does building 4 units every 3 months for 5 years add up to an impact? I don't know where the number 4 came from. I haven't talked to anybody who has proposed that. I wonder if it's this, what this bill would do is say a fourplex is allowed where you have water and sewer service area. The increasing the cap on on priority housing projects maybe accomplishes the same thing, but we would oppose anything that just allows unlimited incremental development over an extended time without some review. And that would do it, as I understand it, without any review necessarily, even, I don't know if it would involve local zoning or not, but it's certainly not location specific. It doesn't deal with the impact that that cumulative development could have on a whole host of natural resources or on community services and facilities.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Members, we're going to take